So I made this Techhnolyze analysis to share my thoughts on the show with other people, but more than that, I made it to figure out what my thoughts actually were. So if I read too much into things or seemingly make things up about characters, just try to bear with me. It's been a while since I've seen the show for the second time, and a little later I try to condense everything to some sort of lesson from the series, and I don't think Techhnolyze really needs to be considered having a lesson or sort of motive at the end. I think what really makes it a good show, and I obviously wouldn't make an analysis like this if I didn't think it was a good show, is that it's just really a story about people. It's about people, and that's really something that you can connect with. A reviewer once referred to Techhnolyze as part of a trilogy of Yoshitoshi Abe projects. If Serial Experiments Lane examines the mind, Habane Renmei concerns itself with the spirit, then Techhnolyze would thematically explore the body. Abe's contribution to these projects is varying, only credited as character designer for Techhnolyze, but what unites them is a clear headspace that must have been shared by the many creators Abe collaborated with in the inception of these original projects. Indeed, Lane's heavy contemplation of social interaction through modern methods, and Habane's bittersweet character study in a highly allegorical setting contrasts with Techhnolyze's more literal and corporeal nature. It's clammy, it's erotic, and it's very often violent. Even Abe's character designs sort of undulate with this coldly suppressed violence. Yet the bodies that Techhnolyze examines are not only those of flesh, but the functional collections of individual egos that inhabit society. Reflective of the living corpse, the world of Techhnolyze is highly organized and brutally hierarchical. Squirming around in this shell are the strong characterizations that root Techhnolyze's themes in relatable human parables. The entirety of Techhnolyze's setting consists of the dichotomous locales of the underground city of Lukuss and the surface above it. What exists beyond is never discussed. What I always envisioned is that Techhnolyze takes place far in the future, where modern societies have risen and fallen many times over. What remains now are these small pockets of civilization existing as these eerily rural or somewhat suburban settlements, contrasting the typical vision of the dystopian future in other such cyberpunk works. Techhnolyze's dystopia lies underground in Lukuss. The show offers a brief explanation of the city's inception in one of the later episodes via a documentary or propaganda piece. It's apparent that there was a fissure of some sort between the people living on the surface. Every human has a monster lurking inside of them, according to the narrator. Those who could not control this monster were sent to Lukuss. Those who killed, or would kill eventually. What exactly this monster is not made entirely clear. Is it an ideological defect, the result of opposing political philosophies fighting for dominance? Or is it more scientific, a detectable mental defect that gives them the potential to kill? Perhaps, seeing as foresight is an ability that humans possess underground, it was a simple matter of reading people's future to determine whether they should be sent below. Isolating these individuals would really only address one of these concerns. Ideologies change with the times, but a genetic defect could be isolated from the larger group to deter their effect on others. Here's how I see this event. Those determined to be prone to violence could be biologically identified. Whatever identifiable aspect this was could have coincided with many other human traits. Looking at the surface world, one can see it is hardly teeming with life, yet it is exceedingly serene, with an uncanny admiration for classical aesthetics. Look at the cars, the buildings, and the way people dress. From the creative perspective, the surface is meant to emulate the paintings of Edward Hopper that embodied the themes of isolation and loneliness, clearly the emotion that they desired to evoke from the audience. Diegetically, what the people of the surface desired is a return to the old ways, a comfortable, unambitious existence. Those who were deemed unfit for this world would have been those with an irresistible urge to strive, advance, create, destroy, or simply act in passion. Thus, they get sent below on the pretext of mining raffia and pursuing research of Techhnolyze limbs. Perhaps there was a great calamitous war that killed many people, and this was an effort to preserve what little humanity is left. We don't really know, and it's less than important.
The result of this schism is quite the opposite of that desire to preserve and persist humanity. The people of the surface have practically grown stale with their idle existence. The first time we see it in the series, the surface is far more twisted version of the idyllic rural paradise that its founders might have envisioned, inhabited by droning radios, shadows, phantoms, and a handful of actual humans. The radios brought to mind a distinctly Orwellian presence. They repeat these nonsensical phrases seemingly endlessly. A mirror improves the ability to think, and silence recedes. What do these phrases mean? Probably nothing, and that's really the point. They seem to be the antithesis to thought. A strict, commanding tone gives these radios a rather cruel and oppressive feel. Thus I find they serve the purpose of keeping the stark numbness in the minds of inhabitants. More on the radios in a bit. The other inhabitants are the phantoms, as they are referred to in the show, appearing as fuzzy humans, not entirely there, or sometimes as shadows cast from an unseen source. The question is, what exactly are these figures? Are they alive? Are they actually ghosts of those long dead? On one hand, they work, converse with the living, and operate machinery. On the other hand, Ichise's father is among them, appearing to Ichise as a chance to apologize for his resentment over the years. My understanding of the phantoms is a bit convoluted, but that's to be expected. When Doc decides to remain on the surface, we're given a scene that appears to depict her demise. As she monologues through a radio, water seeps out from below the door. Given the framing, it's pretty easy to assume that she's killed herself, perhaps by drowning or a blow dryer in the tub. The theming of the surface thus far has equated the inhabitants with the walking dead, and seeing this out-of-body dialogue now gives new context to the radios. Allow me to plunge further down this train of thought. I think what the people of the surface has given up is not only the will to live, but their bodies in return. Judging by the way that the surface dwellers react to Doc's Texhnolyze research, it's clear they don't seem to have a need to maintain a physical form. The phantoms are a stand-in, something that preserves that classical aesthetic. These bodies may be physical, but without a clear ego within, they seem to wither and fade in the light, like an image viewed through many windows or an old photograph. The people of the surface exist as ephemeral words, collections of irreverent ideas. The incessant droning of the radios is like a breathing to them. As long as they speak, they are sufficiently alive. Doc's lingering thoughts are of Ichise, but in the seemingly endless oblivion of the surface world's existence, I imagine they will gradually flatten out to the near static that oozes from the other individuals. Ichise has some interactions with these beings. One offers conversation and even asks Ichise to stay. This might derail my earlier tangent, but I think it is possible that some of these phantoms still cling to a sort of individuality. This might explain Sakimura and Yoshi. They seem to deny the passive nihilistic outlook of the surface and travel to Lukuss in search of a purpose. Interestingly, Yoshi seems to have undergone significant body modification to make the trip. Could this mean that those on the surface have weak and neglected bodies unfit for life in Lukuss? We don't know, and we don't get a good look at Sakimura to see if this is a commonality. The more I look at the phantoms and the surface, it's clear that this should be looked at from a thematic perspective, as they aren't really made to make sense as a tangible element of the world. The people of the surface amputated undesirables from their flock in order to pursue a better existence. Whether or not they intended it, this resulted in their slow and excruciating death. The surface is rife with existential horror. From the phantasmal inhabitants to the socially barren environment, this cultural experiment appears to have failed, or succeeded in the worst of ways. If Lukuss is constantly referred to as the city, then the surface appears as an allegory for rural life. Could this be a scathing indictment of those who refuse progress in favor of preserving outdated and empty values? I somewhat doubt it, considering the fate of the city. Rather, I see it as the ideology taken to its logical extreme. Existing atop the grossly physiological city, the surface serves as the mind for my extended metaphor concerning the human body. At the end of human evolution, they face the question, change or die. It's clear the mind has chosen a peaceful destruction. However, unbeknownst to it, the body has begun stirrings of its own. So we have Lukuss, essentially an underground penal colony for those deemed too dangerous for the surface, seething with grime and filth, rife with periods of violence, and teeming with life. In stark contrast to the world above, Lukuss is more literal in its structure. Indeed, the metaphorical nature of the surface is quite the departure for the series. I consider Lukuss to be the allegorical city, a parable for modern society. It's pretty easy to get this notion as it's constantly referred to as the city. The three factions vying for control of Lukuss serve as allegories of their own. The organo, an organized crime syndicate, represents the mainstream culture, deceitful while being loyal, bound by honor but prone to even the most heinous of acts. This contradictory nature parallels many modern tenets. The politics of organized crime are not unfamiliar to those that control entire countries. The Salvation Union serves as a more traditional, conservative, and spiritual portion of individuals, swearing utter fealty to a power and a cause greater than oneself, unlike the organo, which rewards self-promotion and individual effort. This ideology can be found in many that still value traditional spiritual philosophies. It has united people for both acts of atrocity and utter selfless benefaction. Lastly, the Rakan, shunned by both the prominent factions, stands for the counterculture. Rebellious youth, eager to prove themselves as individuals while denying the importance of larger institutions. Sometimes they are inspired artists and leaders of political revolution, and sometimes they are juvenile delinquents or members of lawless gangs. Lukuss exists as a microcosm of urban living, or at least that portion that continues to grow and strive. Cities that cluster individuals into masses, subsiding on a cruel balance of power that has little sympathy for the unclaimed dregs that litter the streets. This balance is disrupted by two outsider individuals that embody the two major arcs of the series. First, Yoshi, who hails from the surface, makes an absurdly long journey down a spiraling staircase to arrive just outside of Lukuss, where he meets the sage and the seer Ron. These people are a tertiary group of individuals that ruled Lukuss before the organo seized power. They follow a more traditional, ritualistic way of life. Unlike the Salvation Union, they don't adhere to a strict ideology, rather they are guided by the seer, foreseeing the future and choosing the best way to avoid it or enable it. That is how they maintain their order as a group. Ron's abilities are largely taken for granted in the series, as she seems to be a pillar of the city's existence. How do her powers work? If I had to offer an explanation, I would say that it comes from the obelisk in the center of the city. This device powers the Texhnolyze units and helps provide them with the information they need to function, which is in turn relayed to the user's brain. I think of it as a sort of collective consciousness, the way a group of drones would rely on a central computer to do their thinking while being able to act somewhat independently, or like how one's limbs obviously do not think for themselves, yet still seem to react instinctually and relay information to the brain. The giant pillar serves as the supercomputer for the Texhnolyze limbs. What does this have to do with Ron? She seemed connected to the device, considering the way Onishi talks to her in the last couple episodes, and seeing it as both the seer and the pillar have a long history in Lukuss, I would imagine that the two are connected. The supercomputer can gather observations from all the limbs throughout the city and use that data to make predictions. As for how exactly this connection works, well, that's harder to explain. Ron doesn't appear to be Texhnolyzed, and only one seer is born into Lukuss at a time. Perhaps it involves Raphia, as it seems to bridge the gap between machine and flesh for Texhnolyzed limbs. Maybe they expose a seer to it for long periods of time or something. This isn't really important. What matters thematically to the show is that these deposed determinists follow their seer, who is seemingly universally revered by those in the city. Despite it being a modern microcosm, Lukuss is steeped in bizarre traditions, traditions that are challenged by the arrival of Yoshi. Yoshi has no interest in his future, or perhaps he dreads hearing it. Coming from a place as doomed as the surface, I can see why he might resent knowing his precise fate. Yoshi destabilizes Lukuss in an effort to bring forth change, while the other antagonist, Kano, has much more sinister motives. Rather than watch Lukuss change itself, like a petulant child, he wishes to completely reshape it to his own liking. What does it mean for the institutions within Lukuss to struggle and clash? They are ideologically opposed, clearly, but what does fighting accomplish when a hierarchy has already been established? Balance is almost assured until someone or something comes to disrupt it. Yoshi creates this violence for his entertainment more than anything else. What matters is the city survives it, and is no longer the same as before. One could argue that Yoshi's actions served as a catalyst for the city's ruin, but Lukuss walks away from this spectacle only shaken. This kind of internal strife is commonplace. It sparks violence around the world, but a civilization doesn't crumble over every single mass shooting, gang war, or terrorist act. What causes cultures to die out is a dissolution from within. This is what Kano accomplishes. After Yoshi has left the picture, trouble begins to brew in the major organizations. Each second in command starts to have ideas of their own, splintering the groups. Each one turns to Kano's technolization or power to solve their problems. Like moths to a flame, individuals finally see an opportunity to become as strong as the organizations they follow. They can become leaders of their own. Power entices them, but conformity binds them to Kano's ideology. These are the shapes. They parallel the phantoms as they are functionally human while not being entirely there. Once they have served Kano's needs, they take root throughout the city as these vegetative life forms, trapped in a sort of cocoon and left to do nothing but contemplate. Their presence initially serves to unite the rabble of Lukuss. In brief moments of cooperation, those still clinging to humanity fight them off to protect the seer and avert the horrifying fate she has presented to them. When the shapes take Ron away, it is the affirmation of her vision. What she sees for Lukuss is oblivion, and the shapes deliver that dread to what remains of the people in Lukuss. Thus they revert to the most basic of human instincts, unbridled id. Without a larger governing body to protect them, they see no need to maintain order. This fear exists in all individuals, and every society collectively fears its downfall. Even small changes to tradition can terrify those who believe it destroys their way of life. Dredging up this crippling fear, robbing the people of a future they can perceive. This is how societies fall apart. Techhnolyze is often seen as dry and dark, and judging by the larger narrative, that assumption is easy to make. But where all this death and decay finds some redemption is the very human element of Techhnolyze, its characters. The allegory of the setting and overall plot sheds light on what Techhnolyze wants to discuss thematically, but the individual arcs of its characters is where the show really gets across what it wants to say. It's also the most engaging part of the series. While all the characterizations are initially distant, the tantalizing thought of peeling back more layers to find what these people are really about serves as a primary incentive to continue getting deeper into the narrative. Aside from Ichise, the show focuses much of its attention on Onishi. As the organo is probably the most active group in Lukuss, it makes sense that its leader would repeatedly take the spotlight. He effectively controls the entire city, and often claims that it communicates its will to him. The show makes it apparent that this voice of the city exudes from the obelisk. This is why I link Ron's foresight to that pillar as well. Though Onishi's foresight is much less intuitive, it is a voice rather than a clear vision. This could also be an accumulation of his acute awareness from simply surviving and striving in Lukuss for as long as he had. Onishi began his career in the organo at a low rank and reached his current position through a combination of his cunning ambition and cold pragmatism. Onishi comes off as the typical Yakuza badass. He wears a swanky white suit, upholds a strong code of honor, initiates sex, and wipes out goons and shapes alike with his katana. What becomes more apparent is that Onishi is much too self-conscious to uphold that image of the masculine paragon. The inherent contradictions in his life always seem to catch up with him, mainly because he can't help but acknowledge them. His bizarre relationship with his wife is one of the earliest indications of this. It's difficult to tell what exactly is off about her, but she clearly has some mental abnormalities. Onishi is always shown as being the stoic husband enduring his crazy wife, taking solace in an extramarital affair with his secretary. This is the general assumption one can surmise from their relationship. However, when she's killed, Onishi goes through this seemingly affectionate process of cleaning her up and dutifully placing her in the bed, all the while maintaining his same grim, cool demeanor. It's only when Yoshi calls to taunt him that he loses his cool. Perhaps Onishi is acting in the way he thinks he should behave in this situation. What truly frustrates him is that he doesn't genuinely feel anything for her anymore. At least nothing beyond the same general devotion he shows the organo. His wife is another responsibility, and so is Michiko, his secretary. It isn't long after his wife's demise that Onishi stops engaging Michiko sexually. I believe it's a misplaced sense of guilt that stops him. Onishi is the kind of guy who feels responsible for almost everything, even that which is way beyond his control. He tries to let things be, give the people in his life some space, but he's always going to try and shoulder their burdens at some point. It sounds noble, but it's more selfish than that. His paternal relationship with Ichise serves as a good example of this. Onishi is the impetus for Ichise's entire story in the series. Without him, he would have died in the streets after losing his arm and leg. He's also the one to tame him and induct him into the organo. When Ichise asks of him what he should do, Onishi tells him to do what he wants. Onishi wants to give people the free will to do as they please, but he can't escape the urge to shape them to his own moral conscience. Much like how he can't seem to make a move without consulting the voice of the city. When Ichise asks to be a subordinate once again, Onishi tells him to go to the surface, and his phrasing makes strong allusions to this being Ichise's chance to leave the nest. This last request might be Onishi's best attempt to sever his sense of duty to another person, though his departure with Michiko is much more complete. Having found her amidst the chaos permeating Lukuss after Ran's kidnapping, Michiko has been battered and bruised to the point that all she does is beg for death. Onishi at first intends to rescue her, ever the knight-errant, but Michiko makes her position clear, in a matter dripping with innuendo. She sensually caresses his sword, bringing it closer and closer to her quivering lips. It isn't shown, but it can be assumed that the deed is done as Onishi leaves alone. Michiko's feelings for Onishi are clearly unrequited, or if they are, Onishi refuses to act on them. Before, their sexual interactions were always on Onishi's terms, but now she's not only asking to die on her own terms, but she's doing it in the most sexual way possible. Of course, Onishi can't help but oblige. More than a mercy, he's obligated to end her suffering, as it's his fault to begin with. At least, that's how he sees it. Onishi's own death is rife with such irony. Much like everyone else in this city, every ounce of hope has been taken from Onishi, yet he still seeks the guidance of the voice of the city. Ran appears to him, and he insinuates that the voice was her all along, but it seems less that she was the one guiding him, and more that she and the guidance originate from the same source. Gathered around him is the peasantry, the people Onishi protected from the violence that once ravaged Lukuss, but also those he oppressed with his organized gang of thugs. Much like his departed mistress, the voice is asking him to end it with the same sword. At this point, this action could only be symbolic. Onishi isn't bringing an end to the voice itself, rather his relationship with it. There's no more guidance to offer, so once again Onishi penetrates with his mighty sword, giving himself an anchor to support him as the peasantry eviscerates him, leaving only his technolyzed limbs behind. His last words are of sanity, and as the representative of the organo, it makes sense for him to maintain a righteous dignity as civilized man taking a last stand against the barbarian hordes. Techhnolyze's most prominent female presence is Doc, the show's amorous mad scientist. It could be argued that Ron is more significant, but she's more sexless, a child before a woman. If Onishi is Ichise's paternal figure, then Doc is assuredly his surrogate mother. She is directly responsible for his rebirth as a technolyzed human, her finest work no less, her pride and joy. The closest parallel viewers can pin Doc to is the vixen archetype. With her good looks and stylish fur coat and bodysuit, she manipulates men with sex, and her cold exterior hides an inner passion. Soon, however, Doc's methods make it much more apparent that her sexuality isn't a means of controlling other people, and in fact, her passion is far more twisted than it appears. Like Onishi, Doc's motivations are very selfish, though she's much worse at hiding it. She saves Ichise from a painful death by exhaustion because of what she sees in him, the look in his eyes, the look of their ancestors. This is a consistent theme in the series, that the original people to come to Lukuss were a wild and ambitious collective. Yet her description of him through the radio also brings to mind this image of Ichise as the primordial man. I don't think this caused her to believe that Ichise deserved to live. Rather, the prospect of creating a new technolyzed system with such a magnificent canvas was her incentive to save him. Indeed, it is Doc's work that brings her fulfillment, not her interactions with her fellow humans. She does derive this misplaced maternal sentiment for her projects and takes pride in seeing them rise to the ranks. I'd imagine she sees even Onishi's successes as at least partly her own. Her relationships with these fruits of her labor are also romantic. Her and Ichise make up the closest thing Techhnolyze has to a romance. What pleasure does Doc receive from having such affections for these individuals? I believe these feelings are purely masturbatory. Whatever desire she seems to express toward Ichise, or possibly Onishi, is really rooted in herself and her work. She constantly reflects this self-infatuation on others, because despite how much pleasure she clearly derives from her own brilliance, it isn't enough. She needs validation from others, and is constantly seeking the approval from those higher in station than her. Each of her attempts at finding this validation ends in failure. Whether it's the class or her own creations, they all turn away from her, finally ending in the rejection from the surface, with one of the surface dwellers essentially informing her that her entire field of research has been rendered obsolete. With this, Doc loses her entire will to live. She chooses to remain on the surface with all the others who have lost their purpose. Her work gives her life purpose. It is the singular measure of her own brilliance. She adores it, and through it, she adores herself. But at the same time, it's all she has. Her research in technolization is the one thing that forms her entire identity. Without it, she sinks into the void. This kind of obsession is clearly unhealthy, and understanding this about her at the end of the series places much of her actions in a new light. Like any human being, I think Doc is at least somewhat cognizant of how broken she is as a person. Unlike Onishi, this isn't a source of self-doubt, rather just something that can be seen eating away at her in her grimmer moments. The real tragedy of Doc's arc is that she doesn't actually seem aware of how she really has helped these people in her life. Though her reasons may have been selfish, granting Ichise technolization opened up a way of life to him that he would have never experienced. She is as responsible for his transformation as a human being as Onishi is. Then there's the flower. At the end of the series, Ichise lays dying in a puddle of his blood, and his last moments are spent staring at a small, flickering hologram emitted from his technolized arm. It is possible that this is some sort of hallucination, but I'm not satisfied with that explanation. Doc made that arm, and if it's doing something like this, then she must have built it to do so. Why add such an unnecessary function? Perhaps it really is meant to appear when its user is on the brink of death, to offer them some sort of comfort and gently memorialize them. Whether this is unique to Ichise's unit or not, it's small actions like this that Doc is capable of doing for others that she just can't seem to recognize or value. She is singularly responsible for the series' most tender moment and the final lingering tone of its conclusion. Doc isn't incapable of kindness or even selflessness. She just doesn't value those sides of herself. Yoshi's introduction to the audience is stopping to light a burner for his food supply on a mountainous trek from the surface to Lukuss. This is no simple trip. Yoshi has clearly taken on a grave effort with this journey. He also seems to have undergone severe body modification, though it's believed to be technolization that isn't entirely certain. It appears to function in the tunnel, unlike Ichise's arm and leg, and seems much cruder in design and crueler in intention. It's possible he was carrying battery power in his backpack for the descent. As for the crude design, I think it's clear that the surface hasn't bothered improving on technolization, so he's likely using outdated models. But the real question is, why be technolized at all? Judging by the appearance of Yoshi in Sakimura's memories, he seems to be healthy enough. The more sinister functions of Yoshi's units reveal what I believe to be his purpose. Though it is doubtful a man kept lax in the ephemeral surface world would have had the constitution to make the journey, Yoshi did not need a spring-loaded arm blade to complete the descent. Yoshi had clearly thought out his plan and knew that he would perform his task in the deadliest manner possible. Not knowing what kind of place Lukuss had become, he needed to be as equipped as possible to initiate his scheme of violence. Given how skilled Yoshi was at killing and the kind of place the surface is, Yoshi must have undergone extensive training and research before arriving in the city. All this grueling time and effort served the singular purpose of destabilizing Lukuss, creating a violent power struggle that would fundamentally change its hierarchy and means of function. Yoshi sets these lofty goals and makes such exhaustive preparations merely for his entertainment. He does it all for kicks. Though the poignant solitude of the surface was a clear factor in shaping Yoshi's twisted disposition, it can't be the singular cause. Sakimura experienced that same agonizing existence but chose a simple, meditative life underground. What drove Yoshi to depravity existed within him long before he made the descent into Lukuss. He constantly exudes an unnatural serenity. This disposition heavily contrasts the recoiled wariness of the rest of the cast. That serenity takes on a predatory edge once he begins killing with unflinching precision. In the encounter with his first victim, he declares that his actions are a mercy, that he is setting the prostitute free. I think this is his means of establishing rank and power. Hardly unaccustomed to suffering, Yoshi probably does empathize with the insignificant struggles of the scarred and abused. However, by ending their suffering and their lives, Yoshi becomes a being of a higher order, one that determines how the masses live and die. Yoshi seeks to master not only his destiny, but any others he sees fit to interfere with. The only time his serene expression really breaks is when he takes Onishi's wife hostage. In an unexpected bid for her life, she lashes out at Yoshi and catches him off guard. This really seems to get to Yoshi. He could be offended that she denies his perceived benevolence. More significantly, however, it reminds him of his own nature that he can't stand to reflect on. Yoshi's own struggle is bitter and savage. He longs to be a part of a world where violence and desire drive human beings. He desperately wishes to escape from the sinking feeling of anguish that seeps deep from within, originating from his home on the surface.
He has to be important. He has to be superior. Otherwise, he's just another phantom. Ultimately, it is one of these same dregs that brings him down to their level. Not his chosen rival Onishi or Shinji, whom he hoped to make a kind of disciple. A relatively unknown factor, Ichise, ends his grisly vacation, but it is his friend, Sakimura, who grants him a merciful death. Yoshi seems content with this outcome. Really, he couldn't be happier. He is killed in the streets, covered in bruises with a shattered body. He is not dripping away in some ephemeral think tank of ideas long dead, babbling words that have lost meaning. He has become an integral part of the violence that has shaped Lukuss and will continue to shape it. Sakimura, however, is filled with remorse for killing his friend. Though it's easy to claim he did the right thing, he cannot justify his ending another's existence. He does the deed,
which speaks to the responsibility he feels toward Yoshi and emphasizes the contrast between these two men. His anguished confession on the surface reminds the audience of just how uncanny an existence the surface is, as it garners a less than unfeeling congratulations. Kano is more difficult to comprehend as a person. His behavior is decidedly alien. He functions as an arbiter of the high-concept themes the show stresses in its second half. Blatantly childish and self-absorbed, his real focus is forced evolution. He isn't content to simply actuate and be a part of Lukuss's transformation. It must be a part of his evolution as the pinnacle of existence. All sense of self besides his own must be obliterated and incorporated into Kano's world and Kano's experience. Shinji is the most straightforward characterization of Texhnolyze. He embodies the figurative rebellious youth throughout his entire arc. He resents Onishi as an authoritative figure, yet ironically covets that same position, if only for its respect. His interactions with Michiko are quite revealing. Though there seems to be a mutual attraction between the two, their date eventually leads to them discussing Onishi. Like any good urchin, Shinji longs to see how the higher class lives and raise himself to their position. Of course, that desire is stifled when he sees the class as nothing more than a stagnant monoculture existing for Kano's bizarre experiments. In the violent throes of his last moments, Shinji massacres as many of them as he can before finally getting it himself. The scene with the figures in the pool stands out, as the music and the atmosphere create a far more somber mood than the killing spree would suggest. Shinji's last moments are indeed violent, but it at least gives him a chance to really strike back at a world that has repeatedly wronged him. That at least gives him some peace. Ron serves as one of the important catalysts of Texhnolyze's plot, but her character is much less complex as the other principal actors in the cast. On her own, she's a frightened child burdened with a responsibility that she isn't prepared for and tormented by visions of a future she desperately wishes to deny. When viewed through the perspectives of other characters, however, she takes on many forms. She's Ichise's singular understanding of innocence, his salvation, and his measure of certainty for a future he's only recently cared about. In actuality, Ron isn't all that holy. She takes sadistic pleasure in watching Ichise beat the organo's thugs to death, and even seems to have some form of partnership with Yoshi. I think it is profoundly relieving for her to watch the more uncertain factors of her future run amok, anything to distract her from the void. For others, she is emblematic of the city and its will, or even the absolute rule of destiny. Her real tragedy is being unable to come into her own as a person, constantly being an instrument of others' egos. The central through line for Texhnolyze's various characterizations is Ichise. Though focus will shift away from him at several instances throughout the series, the viewer is always reminded that the significance of these themes lies in how they reflect on Ichise and shape him as a person. Sometimes a science fiction or especially cyberpunk story will rely on a relatable everyman archetype to give their audience a foundation for understanding the unfamiliar setting. Texhnolyze takes this a step further by making Ichise less than an everyman, a primordial man. Much of the viewer's understanding of his behavior, especially in the early episodes, is based in knowing how a wild animal behaves. When he first obtains his new limbs, his instinct is to eliminate the foreign bodies, trying with all his might to smash them. Ichise's most human component is the reverence he has for his parents. His mother is memorialized in a grotesque culture of cells that Ichise, out of either naivety or pure delusion, believes is still alive and is enough to be considered his mother. His father gives Ichise his one prior connection to Lukuss. He was some measure of public figure that was entirely mutilated for crossing the wrong people. Ichise blames him for leaving his mother and himself alone, which would eventually cause her to wither away and die. On the surface, Ichise is able to speak to his father's phantom, forgiving him while apologizing for his own resentment. His birth parents are responsible for the man he is when the series begins, but his growth as a human being is entirely the result of his new family. Doc and Onishi become a kind of surrogate parenthood for Ichise, as they both save his life and give him the opportunity to be reborn. With this new life they've given him, Ichise's only desire is to find purpose,
a concept that had previously held no place in his life. This is also when he grows more attached to Ron. Unlike Yoshi, Ichise madly wants to know the future she sees for him. Through this desire, Ichise becomes protective toward her. Though she did rescue him from the sewers with the flowers, what could she have given Ichise that could make her the one person he really seems to care about? Her prophecy for him is unbearably grim, and her salvation is more self-indulgence than charity. I think it's because she fits his narrative. A sweet, innocent girl for him to save from the clutches of an evil fate and in turn give him the purpose and belonging he longed for. It's surprising for how multifaceted the series itself is and how complex most of its characterizations are that Ichise is so simple. That baseness, however, is his strength. Techhnolyze examines the body, the corporeal nature of humans. It explores its vision of the future through the eyes of the human animal, not the human being. Ichise is motivated by instinct, a tenacious, prideful will to live. He is tamed by his father Onishi and cultivated by his mother Doc. They allow him to experience a new state of being, a societal structure with ranks and values. Ichise wants to be a part of that culture. Simply living for survival isn't enough at that point. Will this experience benefit Ichise? Is it anyone's right to drag him unknowingly into such an existence? By the end of the series, everyone Ichise had shared a connection with is either dead or existing in a way he can no longer engage in. He sits in a dark, concrete structure overlooking Lukuss. Beneath him is an ever-growing pool of his own blood. Having just dumped Ron's mutilated corpse over a cliff, Ichise appears reflective. In his reflection, he smiles. The experience was more valuable to him than its outcome. Techhnolyze has been described in countless terms as a grueling study of human suffering and crushing nihilism. However, seeing Ichise stare into the holographic flower while the soft tones of Walking Through the Empty Age give him respite, I could only see an uplifting and hopeful image. The human lives of Techhnolyze are rich, while not always fulfilling. Techhnolyze values the desire to live, to better oneself and one's environment. The same instincts that drive every living creature to grow, kill, and love are precisely what makes people human. If anything, Techhnolyze embraces the crushing inevitability as a positive element. Ichise looks upon his experience with fulfillment because he did not let his place in the societal body cloud his instincts as a living entity. He was able to participate in the fading chapter of the human experience. Whether he chose it or not, the opportunity gave him a truly sublime existence. By the time the audience has followed that thread to its end, seeing Ichise fade away as the credits roll for the last time is a relief, a deserved fanfare for a life well lived.